Hi, everyone, and thank you again for attending this keynote presentation here at VPPC 2020. My name is Wyglinski. I'm a professor of electrical and computer engineering here at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm also the junior past president of the IEEE Vehicular Technology Society. And this presentation is about the work that I do specifically with respect to connected vehicle technology, and in particular, developing algorithms and techniques for enabling reliable connectivity between vehicles as well as with infrastructure in vehicles when there is insufficient wireless electromagnetic spectrum, right? So in particular, I'm going to be talking about this thing called dynamic spectrum access, where we're beginning to see a significant shortage of electromagnetic spectrum supporting different wireless applications. And this is actually quite critical for the connected vehicle community, the autonomous vehicle community, just the vehicular technology community. How are we going to connect all these different platforms on the road in order to enhance safety and enable all this cool technology that we're developing within our communities? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the current research I'm doing in the area of Bumblebee-Inspired connected vehicles, where that wireless spectrum is being accessed using behavioral models that we have adapted from bumblebees. All right. So before I continue, I really want to very much acknowledge the kind and generous support from the U.S. National Science Foundation through awards 1547-291 and 1646-367. Okay, without this sponsorship, like a lot of this work that you see here today would have been possible. So big thank you to the NSF. Additionally, the generous support of the Mathworks, as well as the Toyota Info Technology Center USA. A lot of the results that you see here in this presentation result from research that has been sponsored by both these companies. So thank you again to Mathworks and Toyota. So the presentation has the following outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research lab, where all these results, where this great research has originated from. Then I'm going to talk about why the heck we need vehicular connectivity. Right? Why do we need it? Well, I'm going to explain why we need it. Then, very importantly, what's kind of like the medium, right? The all-important resource underneath vehicular connectivity that's going to support this sort of future vision of all these vehicles, all this infrastructure, all talking with each other. And the issue of vehicular spectrum scarcity, as well as Vehicular Dynamic Spectrum Access, or VDSA. You're going to see that acronym an awful lot here. Following this, I'm going to be talking a little bit about biology. I'm going to be talking about bumblebees and how they forage for nectar from flowers. Oh, wait a minute. There are parallels between that and how vehicle radios forage, try to find wireless channels to communicate across. So that's going to be next. A little bit of a side note, we're going to talk about vehicular beamforming, an efficient way of using electromagnetic spectrum so that we can have more vehicles on the road talking with each other without running into the spectrum scarcity issue I was talking about before. And then finally, we're going to look at a use case, which is vehicular platooning. Okay, so a quick thing about my lab. So this is my lab. No, just kidding. But no, seriously, my research lab consists of myself, my PhD students, my master's students, my undergraduate students, visiting researchers, everyone. And it's a great community because a lot of research we do, it's not kind of individually siloed, but it's really all community driven. Like people have different expertise, different insights, different experiences, and we all come together to help each other create some really cool stuff. And we're a great diverse team here at WPI in the Wireless Innovation Lab. We focus on educational activities, we focus on both basic and applied research, and we try to tackle really challenging problems that are being experienced by the nation and society today. We have expertise in 5G communications and networking, space and satellite comms, machine learning and cognitive radio, connected autonomous vehicles, that's the focus of this presentation, and software-defined radio prototyping. We do this and quite a bit of other activities here in the Wireless Innovation Lab. A bit about myself. I'm a full professor in electrical engineering and robotics engineering. I have 8 PhD students, 4 master students. As I said, junior past president of the Vehicular Technology Society. It's a great society, really excited about serving all our members over the last several years. I'm also co-founder of the MITRE WPI Collaboratory, as well as the New England Workshop on Software-Defined Radio series that we have here every year. It's the best time of year for me, even better than Christmas. I published 46 journal papers and 121 conference papers, 9 book chapters, and 3 books. Okay, enough about me. Let's jump into the motivation for vehicle connectivity. And it's really important. It really is, okay? So the last 5 years, we've seen like a huge increase in the amount of interest in self-driving car technology, right? So we see whole companies rise up from places like Silicon Valley, Detroit, and around the world, focus on making this sort of like science fiction-like topic become a reality, right? So the idea of self-driving cars has actually been around since the 1920s. There's this thing called phantom car, where folks were trying to make vehicles drive without any human behind the wheel, right? And part of the reason for like the last 5-ish years of like all this sort of intense, rapid increase in research and development work and even prototyping deployment of self-driving car technology has really been a number of factors, right? So computing technology has matured to such an extent that we can perform operations, implement algorithms, do decision-making relatively quickly, fast enough that it now is viable to deploy on self-driving cars, right? Like because remember, these vehicles need to drive as good, maybe even better than human-operated vehicles, okay? Secondly, there's a lot of algorithmic development, especially in AI and machine learning. Those are very critical because of the decision-making processes that the self-driving cars need to execute. There's also a lot of work, right, an increasing amount of work into technologies that sense the world around every self-driving car, right? So radar has been around and it has matured, right? And radar systems are pretty darn reliable nowadays. Same thing with vision systems. Like these are topics that have been around for 20, 30, 40 years, right? But one technology, LiDAR, right, which is very similar to radar, except that it's light emitting rather than just EM pulse emitting, like chirps and such. LiDAR is something that has really rapidly grown and is emerging. It hasn't matured yet, but that's one of these sensing technologies that really people have looked at and say, wow, I think I could use this and make that vehicle, that self-driving car, have excellent situational awareness of the environment around it. Let's look at it from the top down, right? So this is like, suppose is your self-driving car. So the way self-driving car operates, like in a nutshell and such, is that it takes environmental stimuli, right? So what's happening around it? Like where is it in its position to the world? Where are the other vehicles? Are there pedestrians? Is there a stoplight? Are there cars crossing the intersection? Do I need to stop? Is there ice on the road? All this sort of information, okay? And it takes it fuses it into some sort of like understanding of what the world is around it. The decision-making algorithm then takes that information and says, you need to do this, right? And it does it with extremely low latency, right? And then once the algorithm, the AI on board, the decision-making process says, we need to do this, it feeds it into whatever sort of control algorithm, most likely some sort of nonlinear control algorithm, applies it to the vehicle, and then the vehicle executes. Now, again, it's really important that, physical vehicles are very heavy. There's also things like friction coefficient. There's road surfaces. There's the type of material that tires are made of. There's momentum and all these other physical stuff. So all of that needs to be accounted for end to end, all the way from the sensory information of the environment around the vehicle into the decision-making process, into translating into action such that ultimately the vehicle complies with all rules and regulations and is safe and to everyone around it. All right. Now, as I said, the major sensing technologies here are things like the vision systems, so stereoscopic camera systems, things like, for instance, like radar systems, and of course, LiDAR. So with these sensing technologies, a self-driving car has a pretty darn good sense of the environment around it. Its situational awareness is pretty good within its immediate vicinity. So it can make these decisions like, there's nobody there, I think I'm going to change lanes. Oh, I'm this far away from the car ahead of me, I'm going to keep at this safe distance. Oh, I think that this road is going from 2 lanes into 1, I better execute a lane change that is legal in this state or jurisdiction. Okay. And so I mentioned LiDAR. So LiDAR, this is a great example of what LiDAR looks like from the perspective of LiDAR. What it does is it bounces these lasers all around, and then it takes the reflections and says, this is what my environment looks like. And so it turns it into a 3D point cloud and says, okay, here's a bunch of pedestrians, cars. These are like the stripes on the road. Like that paint that's just slightly above the surface of the road can be detected potentially by a LiDAR system, and everything else around it. So there's a point cloud that gets fed into the decision-making process. There's radar that also gauges where everything is in front and behind of the vehicle. And of course, vision systems as well, identifying whatever is within range of the camera system. So all of these sources of information goes into the decision-making process. And then once a decision has been made, the control algorithms kick in, like path and motion planning. I want to do a left turn. Are there any cars that are coming in the opposite direction towards me? And stuff. Oh, no, they're at the stoplight. Okay, what's the color of stoplight? It's green. Okay, proceed forward. All these decisions, all this information, so that this car in this particular image can very safely execute a left turn onto this cross street. And why are we doing this? Like, you know, what's the major motivator for self-driving cars? Sure, it's cool. Sure, it's futuristic. It would be really neat to have, but really the thing is safety, right? There's about 37,000 lives that are lost every year in the United States alone due to traffic fatalities, right? Traffic accidents. And the majority of them are due to human error, right? So what do? If you put in a self-driving car that is, you know, always aware of its environment, it's always collecting information, and it doesn't allow for any sort of lapse in judgment or anything of that nature, what happens is you're progressively trying to take the human error out of the equation, which should translate into a significant decrease in loss of life on the roads. So that's really why we're doing this, right? But here's the problem. So your self-driving car, just based on these sensors, like on the left, the radar, middle, image systems, right, LiDAR, right? The decision-making process and the actions that are taken on by the self-driving car are only as effective as the information it has about the environment to begin with. This is a problem because all of these sensing modalities all require, all of them just go as far as the first vehicle in front of it, or until whatever it observes, it cannot kind of see past, right? No X-ray vision here. Past objects, past vehicles, past buildings, trees, and such. It's quite limited. It's only what I see immediately around it, and not, let's say, a quarter of a kilometer away. Or there's this big truck blocking my field of vision, and oh yeah, there's a car accident right in front of it, and it's about to brake really suddenly. So what do? Connected vehicles. So connected vehicles, the way I like to sell it to folks, is the sixth sense that's going to enable self-driving cars to take off, right? Right now, we're seeing self-driving cars kind of start to plateau in development, where, again, we're trying to do as much as possible to really enable the full potential of LiDAR systems, and it's getting there, but what we're beginning to see is sort of a plateau in reliability, because what's ended up happening is we only can sense what's immediately around us, but when you or I drive, we get to sense more than just what's in front of me and what's behind me. Like we tend to sense maybe what might not be sensed by a LiDAR or vision system or radar system, right? So what wireless connectivity does is it extends the situational awareness across a much wider area. So now my situational awareness, my understanding what is happening around the environment is much more comprehensive. I can make more informed decisions, that self-driving vehicle, right? And it could perform actions that are way safer and really significantly reduce the potential for an accident that could result in, say, a fatality, right? So this wireless connectivity business is actually big stuff. This is what's going to take that sort of development of self-driving cars from, kind of like that plateau what we're beginning to see, right? Sure, self-driving cars use GPS information. They do connect to the cloud and collect information a little bit here and there, but not to the V2V, the vehicle-to-vehicle or the vehicle-to-infrastructure type of connectivity that's being envisioned by researchers in this community, right? So really, like, wireless connectivity is a huge game changer. Like, for instance, suppose we have an intersection here, and the vehicle over here in red doesn't see this vehicle that might be running that intersection until it's too late. What happens? There's a collision. But with wireless connectivity, it doesn't need to physically see it. It just needs to be able to connect with it wirelessly and they all talk with each other. I'm going to be performing this action. Here I am. That's where I'm going. This is where I'm driving. This is what I'm going to be doing in the next 5, 10, 15 seconds. Wow. You've just taken a lot of uncertainty out of a very complex environment and across all vehicles. So that randomness factor, that's kind of a concern, begins to get minimized really quickly. Okay. And eventually what we'll have with all this V2V business is we're going to have something along the lines of a vehicular Internet of Things, right? Vehicles sharing information with each other. Maybe they each share with each other what they both see from different perspectives. It gives something even more comprehensive than that point cloud from LiDAR, right? And what happens is, let's say 5 minutes later, it shares information with vehicles heading towards an environment and says, hey, heads up, there's going to be some construction there. You might want to be a little bit aware of that. Oh, thank you. Things like that. So like the potential of having that information sharing is actually like a huge game changer. So now, what are the challenges? Well, so far, right now, it's first of all coming up with a technology that everybody can agree with in terms of enabling vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure or whatnot. There are two competitors. There's cellular V2X, right? That's like kind of based off of 5G cellular telephony. And then there's also IEEE 802.11p, which is a variant of the Wi-Fi standard that's also used to support V2V. So we have at least two different standardized technologies out there, and there are different ways of how they establish wireless links with each other. And what we need to do is be able to ensure that vehicles are able to communicate with each other for maneuvers such as the one here. Like, you might not think about it, but doing a lane change, okay, in traffic is actually a very dangerous proposition. If you're maintaining your lane and you're driving behind, let's say, another vehicle and it's driving behind another vehicle and such, all you're responsible for is the vehicle ahead of you. You don't even care about the vehicle behind you. That's that person's role, right? You just have to pay attention with the vehicle ahead of you. Don't run into their bumper, right? And just keep a safe distance and go at a safe speed. No problem. When you try and change lanes, when you're trying to pass that vehicle, that's super complicated. People don't realize it because what you're trying to do is you're trying to go in a lane that has a potentially different velocity, a different rate of traffic flow. Cars are probably going much faster, and you have to somehow merge while not colliding with the cars that are in your current lane. So you have to accelerate pretty quickly to merge into it. That requires a lot of connectivity, not with just like the car that's ahead of you, car 2, and car 4, which might be ahead of you in the new lane, but also car 3 that's accelerating towards where you're going to merge to, right? And then, of course, this thing, this concept, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, platooning. Platooning has a lot of benefits, especially for transportation of goods using lorries or semi-trailers and trucks and such, because what ends up happening is if you have enough vehicles, especially these huge trucks that are aerodynamically not smooth, right? They're all pushing air, a lot of air resistance out of the way, so it affects fuel efficiency. But suppose you have a train of these vehicles and they're very close to each other. You create some sort of slipstream. They become one single aerodynamic entity. And therefore, you actually, over long haul, actually use less fuel than if you had individual vehicles, each pushing a lot of air out of the way. And again, in order to do platooning, that's kind of a risky proposition because you got to do, these vehicles have to be really close to each other. And if they stop, there's not much of a braking distance, especially given the amount of mass that each has and the velocity that they're traveling. And again, friction coefficients, even if you have 16 or 18 tires on the road, it may not be enough to prevent you, when you brake, colliding into the truck ahead of you. But this is the worry. This is what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this presentation. This is what makes me nervous. So imagine how you have hundreds of cars in this one small stretch of highway, and there's a lot of this happening across the United States and probably around the world at any given time. What do? And if all of these want to have access to wireless spectrum, to me, the #1 resource for enabling vehicle connectivity is going to be access to wireless spectrum. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to find some little tricks here and there that will enable the future of connected vehicles to happen regardless, okay? If there's a spectrum scarcity issue, we're going to work smarter, not harder. We're going to be able to use these intelligent techniques such that every vehicle will have access, or will increase the probability as best we can for every vehicle to have access to wireless spectrum to enable communications with each other. And this is where we first of all talk about the vehicular spectrum scarcity issue. Okay, so in order to enable, in order to kind of mitigate the spectrum scarcity issue, and spectrum scarcity is everywhere. It's not just vehicle connectivity, it's all sorts of connectivity. 5G systems and such is a huge problem because, well, like or any sort of wireless application, because more and more people are using wireless. Like these wireless spectrums, it's a finite amount of spectrum. Well, spectrum's infinite, but usable spectrum for wireless applications very finite, right? And it's very geographically dependent. So what ends up happening in very densely populated areas with lots of wireless applications, we're going to have little to no spectrum available to support any additional wireless application. So what do? You use vehicular dynamic spectrum access. So the trick that you pull off is, let's suppose there are unused bits, unused frequency bands of wireless spectrum, right? The goal is to communicate, for vehicles to communicate with each other in these unused portions of spectrum temporarily without interfering with the licensed applications that have rights over those frequency bands. They might not be using it, but they are the legit licensed entities to those spectrum bands. So we cannot transmit or interfere with these licensed transmissions. But when they're not transmitting in these frequency bands, we take advantage of it and we do our vehicle-to-vehicle communications. So, and this sounds pretty complicated, right, already. So we're using spectrum that at any moment can be used by a primary user, primary transmission, okay? And we need to establish these links between vehicles. This already sounds pretty complicated. So the first thing we need to know is, first of all, what would be suitable wireless frequency bands that we can pull off VDSA, okay, and characterize the behavior of the primary transmissions, the primary users, okay? That's a terminology. We call them PUs, okay? And so the first thing we do is we look at how primary user spectrum behaves. Low-hanging fruit, digital television spectrum. There are a lot of these gaps, right? Not all TV channels are used, right? There are sometimes some unused frequency channels, right, TV channels, that we could potentially exploit for the purposes of doing vehicular dynamic spectrum access. So in 2009, my team did a project with Toyota Info Technology Center, and what we did is we characterized television spectrum across all 139 miles of the Interstate 90 across all of Massachusetts in order to see if there's any opportunities. How does the wireless spectrum behave that we can take advantage of it for potentially doing vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity? This is kind of a cute diagram, illustration of how the interstate looks like from Boston all the way to the border of New York State, right? And at different places, because the thing about television spectrum is it doesn't change with time, but it changes with distance, right? So if you have a TV transmitter in Boston, you're going to have some channels that are going to be used by Boston TV channels and some that are not. But as you progressively move away from the Boston service area, those Boston channels begin weaker and weaker, and soon are no longer register and are considered available. And then you begin picking up other TV channels from other TV broadcasting locations, right? So that's what we did. We basically took, I think, how many measurements? It doesn't say here. I think it was like 48 measurements all across the state of Massachusetts. Here's Boston. Here's the border with New York State, and Albany is over here a little bit further. And what we did is we created this map. And what this map is, this is the wireless spectrum density map. And what it tells us, right, is it tells us the amount of transmit power that we are permitted to communicate, right? So so in dB, so this is scale. So red means we can transmit at a very high power level, and blue means we can transmit at an extremely low power level. What does this mean? This means like these blue bands here probably are the locations of existing television channels. So we're not allowed to interfere with those channels, so we have to transmit at a low, if not impossibly inconceivable transmit power. Red means there are probably no primary user TV channels anywhere to be found. Probably here's one, here's one. So this is pretty far away spectrally. We can transmit at a very high power here. And yellow means we can transmit at a lower power, because the rule of thumb is we cannot interfere with the digital television channels. They can interfere with us, but we can't interfere with them, right? And what we see is this is spatial from Boston, Newton, Framingham, Westboro, Auburn, Sturbridge, Palmer, Chicopee, Blanchford, West Beckett, Lee, and West Stockbridge. Okay, so this is from east to west across Massachusetts. Okay, and here's some publications that we published. This was great work, and we published extensively with Toyota on the various sort of discoveries we came up with, understanding what the wireless spectrum looks like, as well as some mechanisms for potentially accessing, using vehicular dynamic spectrum access, these television channels. And a few more. Okay, but another way of doing this, you know, we can come up with a heuristic algorithm, or we can turn to Mother Nature, right? So Mother Nature has optimized our animals. So, you know, survival of the fittest, right? So animals just don't exist. They've been optimized over millions of years into what they are today in order to maximize their probability of survival given the environments that they inhabit, right? So bumblebees, right? So they've been optimized to forage for nectar. That's their food source, in order to support their own lives as well as to procreate and continue the bumblebee species, right? So they have a mechanism for for determining which flowers they should visit a lot and collect food, and which flowers they should avoid because there's not much of a reward. The goal is you need to maximize reward and minimize cost. Cost is expending energy, flying around, finding flowers that don't pay off, and reward is that nectar, that precious nectar. So can we take that same behavior, the bumblebee foraging, and apply it to accessing wireless spectrum? The answer is absolutely yes. So this is sponsored by one of my NSF grants, okay? And this is in collaboration with Professors Giguère, who's now at University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, and Professor Liz Ryder, who's in biology at WPI as well. So what we did is we did this translation between how bumblebees forage for nectar and how vehicles would forage for available wireless spectrum. And not all spectrum is the same. Some spectrum is really awesome signal-to-noise ratio, great low noise floor, almost no interference, and other spectrum is less desirable. Forget about any spectrum that's like has a primary user present in it. We want to stay away from those. So what we did is we looked at how bumblebees foraged, right? So what bumblebees do is they go and they sample all these flowers, they remember the type of flower, the color of the flower, and then what it says is, in this case, step 2, white flowers actually produce the most nectar. It's really great. I'm going to maximize reward and only forage from white flowers. But what happens occasionally is nectar is not a constant. Nectar is also a time-varying function. It might increase, it might decrease. So what ends up happening is occasionally bumblebees will sample from red flowers or from blue flowers or purple flowers, and then might realize, hey, red flowers are actually pretty good, maybe even better than white flowers, and then would adapt and would switch and go after. So bumblebees are adapted for sort of like quickly, you know, sort of changing strategies and saying, this used to be a high reward flower, but now I'm going to go to this flower because now it's paying off. So, and the thing is, there's a term that the biologists refer to with respect to bumblebees. These are socially independent animals. They'll take information from other bumblebees within their hive, within their colony, but it will also sample on its own and make its own decisions, ultimately in order to survive, ultimately to collect the most nectar. Other socially dependent insects like honeybees and ants, it's a very different, very rigid regime. They'll collect information, but only the hive, only the colony will decide. So even if the red flower is producing now more nectar than the white flower, until the colony says otherwise, it's going to collect from the white flower. So not as agile, right? So we would do the same thing with vehicle connectivity and accessing available wireless spectrum. Is we would first sample all the frequency bands, determine which ones are the best ones to communicate across, both in terms of the quality of the channel, as well as how frequently is being occupied or communicated across. We would prefer to go to a channel that doesn't have much traffic, has pretty good SNR, because then we would communicate for long periods of time without being interrupted, high quality transmissions, right? But occasionally, as you know, more cars come in, more users begin to use those channels, and what ends up happening is we actually, it might actually cause us to be interfered with by other communications. Other channels might free up, and those channels might have great SNR. We resample it, we adapt, we observe, we sample. We constantly are looking for the best possible opportunities. We're socially independent vehicular radios. And so that's how we would do in an environment like this. This is kind of a simple, cute little diagram of a bunch of cars. But what would happen is that these vehicles would use things like, for instance, we would have 3 channels. And what would end up happening is we would have these vehicles each individually monitor and sample and observe what the channels look like. Channels 1, 2, and 3. Are they occupied a lot? Are they not occupied a lot? Do they have great signal noise ratio quality? Do they not? And based on that, we would make the decision in order to communicate across it. And we would be continuously learning and updating and monitoring such that we always maximize reward and minimize cost. Okay. There are some parallels in terms of terminology. So things like floral species is channel in the vehicle world. Bumblebee foraging is channel sensing. And the list goes on and on and on in terms of the similarities between these two worlds, right? And it took actually quite a few months between my biology collaborators and myself to be able to create this sort of like a sort of matching dictionary between our 2 different languages. And so I mentioned about the Bumblebee algorithm. So what happens is we initialize the model. The bumblebee discovers a flower of specific type. That basically translates into an unoccupied channel. Have we seen that channel before? If yes, we update the memory if the nectar level or the quality of the channel has changed. If no, we evaluate it and we store its performance, its quality in memory. And then, does the nectar amount exceed the harvest threshold? Does the channel quality, okay, exceed the quality we need in order to do any sort of useful communications? Does it meet our minimum requirements to maximize our reward? Yes or no? If no, if it doesn't meet our threshold, we go and we check on a new flower species. We look at a new channel and we do this thing iteratively over and over again until we identify those channels that we can communicate across. And then we harvest it, we transmit across that channel. And what we do is we always sample. We always evaluate in order to make sure that we always get the best possible channel, or at least a channel that's good enough that maintains the quality of the transmission that we're seeking. And the #1 thing that we're trying to avoid, and this is what we do, and we actually published this in the proceedings of the 87 VTC in June of 2018 is we try to minimize one of the quality metrics that we use for this algorithm is switching costs. We want to avoid as much as possible having to pick up our channel, or like, our communications and go to a different channel. That's very irritating because for our radios, they got to resynchronize, do a lot of handshaking, and reestablish that link on a new channel. We want to avoid that. We want to avoid switching over from one channel to another, to another, to another. And what ends up happening is, in terms of probability density function, we see that in an urban environment, because of the population density and sort of the dynamics of the environment, right? Because cars are all over the place, the switching costs are actually quite a bit higher in an urban because of the density of the vehicles, and just the environment itself is very complicated versus highway, which you might say, isn't it complicated? Yeah, but if the traffic flow is pretty consistent, it's just one dimension of travel, and cars are kind of slowly entering and exiting outer range of each other, okay? And then things like the probability that the channels are busy, and we looked at different transmission rates. And again, like it's important to look at when we increase the amount of messages that there is a substantial increase in the probability that a channel is actually busy, okay, as we see here. And that's like over here, that's like 10 to the minus 1, like, or 0.5, that's like 50-50, right? And we actually, and this got published in the 91st IEEE Vehicular Technology Conference just earlier this year in May 2020, we actually implemented this in hardware. We actually did the CV2X standard. We actually used Open Air Interface, OAI, and ran it on 2 USRP X310s. And what we did is we facilitated vehicle-to-vehicle communications in this environment, in this hardware experimental prototype with a side link PC5 connection. And what we did is, this is the actual photograph of the hardware testbed that we did in order to enable that vehicle-to-vehicle link. Both of these are religiously implementing CV2X via the OAI open source software package. And we collected a bunch of memory results, okay? For both 5 megahertz bandwidth and the 10 megahertz channel bandwidth for enabling that. And what we notice is that for a higher bandwidth, we get more latency, but again, that's because we're trying to find bands, okay, in this environment, like, oh, you need to secure a 10 megahertz band. Well, if you have a lot of other channels, trying to find a nice 10 megahertz swath of spectrum might be a lot more difficult than finding little bits of 5 megahertz of spectrum. And some references to also check out. And we publish extensively in both VTC, as well as IEEE Access and the like. In terms of vehicular beamforming, this is not VDSA per se, but it's very useful. What happens is with vehicular beamforming, what we look at, and this is the other NSF grant that we have, is what we look at is, in a nutshell, if you do beamforming, you could do a lot of sort of spatial, you can actually do a lot of spatial reuse between multiple vehicles. So you only communicate information to the desired target, and free up, okay, with minimal interference to other radios that might be communicating on the same frequency band, right? So what we want to look at is, 1, is this feasible? 2, what happens if you don't have perfect location information of where your transmitter receiver is, so that you have beamforming positioning errors. So this is what beamforming in a vehicular environment is, when you have 2 vehicles potentially using the same frequency band, right? You have vehicle to vehicle, and let's say you have these other vehicles that are also beamforming, and let's say one accidentally is pointing at you, but you're beamforming at another vehicle. So what happens, right? So we need to characterize, first of all, whether it's feasible to do beamforming between a transmit vehicle and a receive vehicle, and what's the impact of positioning error. So beamforming, sort of like, this is the expression that you would have for beamforming. And that's your array factor, and it's a factor of things like the azimuth. What you do is you also calculate what the receive power is through a path loss expression using free space propagation model. And what we're looking at is when you don't beamform in the right direction. You think the vehicle's here, but it's actually there. So what happens is it's not getting the maximum amount of energy from your beam pattern, and you're also projecting a lot of energy somewhere else, and that somewhere else could potentially interfere with someone else's communication. So we do the position error calculation. So there's an extensive amount of literature out there in terms of doing GPS position, measurement, and error calculations, right? Based on dilution of precision, okay? And then what we do is we also calculate the standard deviation of the RMS error, right? And so what we ultimately do is we calculate what the signal to noise ratio looks like as we change distances between transmitters and receivers. So what happens is the farther away they are, the greater the probability that with GPS error, we're going to be way off. If they're close together, even with GPS error, as they say, is like you can't miss. It's like hitting the side of a barn. It's like your vehicle you're trying to transmit to, you can't miss it. But if it's far away and your beam pattern's really focused, even a slight positioning error issue, you could have a very significant decrease in signal noise ratio, which is what we have here. The colors represent the number of antennas. And the more antennas you have, right, the finer your beam pattern is, right? The more narrow that main lobe is. And so we looked at the issues of bit error rate with different antennas as a factor of distance. And what happens is, again, with positioning errors, this takes a huge toll on bit error rate because all you need is to be slightly off at a very far distance and your beam pattern, your like your bore site is not on target, and it could take a huge SNR hit. We're also looking at interference when that beam pattern is going somewhere else when it shouldn't. And we're trying to generalize using an interference model. And we looked at that when we have vehicles that are passing by that are using the same frequency and also beamforming when two vehicles are beamforming, because beamforming is not perfect. There are side lobes, and it does pick up radiation, electromagnetic propagation outside of the main bore site, right? So we have to be very mindful, and this will also take a hit in terms of the bit error rate, as we see here for L equals 4 antennas, 8 and 16 antennas in a dipole, right? A dipole antennas. And we published so far in a couple of the VTCs. So if you want to know more, we definitely check out our references there. Now, finally, the use case with vehicle platooning. So this is what we've been waiting for. So what we want to look at is, can we do platooning with automatic cruise control? So coordinated automatic cruise control. So we have a bunch of vehicles driving on this very populated street, and a bunch of vehicles here in another platoon going the opposite direction. How do they connect with each other so that they're like one? They're able to communicate with each other with low latency and perform really complicated actions. So what we did is we tried to execute, we did a computer simulation of platooning with this CACC, this automatic cruise control, right? And we communicated information over digital television spectrum in a dynamic spectrum access manner, so VDSA. And what we did, okay, is we looked at the received average power, dBm, so decibels per milliwatt, okay, at different television frequencies. And what we did is we looked at these two TV channels, and what we looked at is the rate. So this is more at the network layer, the successful rate of packet reception, right, in the car position in the platoon, right? And we looked at both when we had no switching of channels and when we used the Bumblebee algorithm. And we looked at car position 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9 cars. So 9-car long platoon. And we noticed that the probability of successful reception of these packets goes down, 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 okay? Because of all this, this intra-platoon communications, because of the message rate, what happens that last car, unfortunately, there's going to be latency from the first car and the coordination between all of them with respect to accessing that wireless spectrum. Okay, and we published one already earlier this year at VTC May 2020. Okay, so with that, that concludes my presentation. What's really important is there's a lot of research activity here in the space of getting wireless access for enabling vehicle-to-vehicle communications. It's really important, especially with respect to spectrum access. So we're actively working in this, and in order to enable sort of the continued growth and development of self-driving cars, making them safer than human-operated vehicles, this is absolutely necessary in order to implement reliable connectivity and reliable access to wireless spectrum. So with that, thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the road.